Playing jazz and teaching and learning jazz are often portrayed as being the same thing, but they're not the same. Teaching isn't the same as playing, and just because someone is good at playing doesn't mean they're good at teaching. Have you come across this assumption? I bet you have. Let me tell you about why it's wrong, and even more importantly, how it can be harmful. I'm Saul Richardson, and welcome to Teaching Jazz, where I make videos about jazz education, about playing jazz, and where I often debunk myths and assumptions about jazz using logic, research, and my experience of over 30 years as a jazz teacher and player. In 2007, a prominent jazz journalist and critic, Nate Chinen, wrote that the place where musicians find increasing opportunities is within educational institutions, which often means a better quality of instruction. He continued on to add that there's a disconnect between jazz education and the performance and the business of jazz. There's more than one wrong assumption in those statements that can't be left unexamined. The first false assumption is that jazz education fails to reflect the world of professional jazz performers. We should acknowledge before I continue, though, that Nate Chinen was right on the money elsewhere in the same article, in which he was talking about a conference of the then International Association for Jazz Education. He was quite correct when he noted that jazz education and jazz performance are two worlds that are separate but symbiotic. But the notion that jazz education is inadequate because it fails to accurately reflect the music business is simply wrong. Nate Chinen's assertion that there is a disconnect between jazz education and performance and the business of jazz problematizes the difference between distinctly different worlds or fields that can't be directly compared in that way. The field of jazz education, or pedagogy, teaching and learning, and the field of professional performing and music business are not the same as each other. Each one has its own distinct objectives and logics. Education is for learning about the thing and extended cumulative building up of knowledge and skill over time in how to do the thing. Professional performance is about things like playing concerts for audiences, touring, recording, marketing, and professional development. The implication that jazz education somehow erroneously fails to reflect what professional players do at gigs is faulty. But at the same time, it's a widespread criticism of jazz education, pervasive in discourse about the field, and it bears closer scrutiny. So, let's examine this issue. An excellent example of the kind of highly problematic thinking about jazz education that I'm talking about can be found in the writing of jazz pianist and jazz teacher Hal Galper. Hal Galper is a jazz pianist and teacher of jazz at Purchase College and the New School of Jazz and Contemporary Music. His bio in his own online press kit notes that his teaching credits also include international visiting lecturer to over 100 colleges and universities. Keep this background in mind for just a moment while I tell you about some of Hal Galper's arguments about jazz education. Galper exemplifies this illogical thinking, conflating pedagogy and performance in a 1993 article in Jazz Notes magazine, and it's reprinted for us on his website. There, he noted that most great jazz musicians that I have had the good fortune to apprentice with could demonstrate but not always tell you what they were playing. In the article, Galper argues that the real heavy lifting in jazz education is personal, that is, self-teaching. In his view, masters can present their playing, but it's up to the students to teach themselves whatever they can from their encounter with their master. He prefers to call them apprentices instead of students. He yearns for an imaginary world of the past and a jazz utopian future in which every successful jazz musician is self-taught on the bandstand through a kind of master-apprentice relationship, devoid of any explicit instruction, but based on some unspecified pedagogy prevalent in Africa. Which part of Africa? who, what, when or how is never made clear in arguments like Galper's. And to be certain, Hal Galper isn't alone in making such arguments. Rather, he's one of a chorus of voices in discourse about jazz that criticises jazz education for not being African enough. In fact, it isn't a real Africa, but a rhetorical Africa, one that exists in jazz education discourse as a counter to the apparently cold, clinical, theoretical, technicist, inflexible, robotic, industrial, commercial, authoritarian, and apparently unified approach that supposedly characterizes Western jazz education. This isn't a new idea, and it's not at all an original idea. It's a kind of discursive lick, a riff that they all quote. It's the intellectual equivalent of what these people all claim that jazz students do in their playing, and presumably also every jazz musician who has ever studied jazz at school, university or college, or any other formal or organised setting. Like Galper, for instance, we've got to assume he himself is a graduate of Berkeley. This generic Africa looms large over a rhetorical horizon in too much discourse about jazz education. Hal Galper is scathing of conventional, formal jazz education in schools, condemning it as technicist, dully bureaucratic and conservative and creatively stifling. Perhaps Galper's strongest condemnation is in his assertion that most jazz education fails to produce graduates who can play jazz. And, I quote, "One well-known educator once expressed to me a recurring nightmare. What if we graduated a student who couldn't play jazz? I would postulate that this is the case with a majority of the graduates of the current educational system." Hal Galper, 2000. It's on his website. Now that's the same system that produced players, and please excuse me for lazily quoting Wikipedia for just a moment. It's the same system that produced players like Brad Meldau, Jason Moran and Vijay Iyer, guitarist Kurt Rosenwinkel, vibraphonist Stephen Harris, trumpeters like Roy Hargrove and Terence Blanchard, sax players like Chris Potter and Joshua Redman, and Christian McBride, the bassist. Wikipedia left out lots of players, and whoever wrote that article forgot apparently that women and even some non-Americans play jazz too. So, allow me to add some more examples. There was Esperanza Spalding, Grace Kelly, Shannon Barnett, Diana Krall, Nikki Perrott, Lisa Perrott, Linda Mahan-O, Jamie Ollers, Jeremy Rose, Simon Ferenczi, Andrea Keller, Kristen Berardi, Camilla Metza, Michael League, and Kamasi Washington. I could go on, of course, but here's the point. There are a multitude of outstanding and distinctive jazz artists who came up through the exact jazz education system that Galper decries in his article as failing. To be sure, Galper is by no means the only commentator to proclaim the failure of jazz education, but they're all demonstrably wrong. Remember, even Galper himself studied at Berkeley College, as did other prominent and successful players who have made unique and, I think, significant contributions to jazz. Berkeley graduates, for instance, include musicians like John Schofield, Pat Metheny, Toshiko Akiyoshi, Branford Marsalis, Cindy Blackman, Donnie McCaslin, Keith Jarrett, Emily Remler, Quincy Jones. It just goes on and on. It's hard to find a prominent jazz artist since about the 1930s, if not earlier, who has not participated in jazz education. Look, I'm getting a bit off track here, and this topic will be for another day, but the fact is that attacks on jazz education's efficacy or validity or significance aside, a popular riff in discourse about jazz is to slam jazz education for being disconnected from the professional world of playing jazz. On the one hand, this is simply untrue. Anyone who's involved in jazz education knows that it's populated by students and teachers who are gigging, jamming, making music, and forming dynamic, creative communities. There aren't coldly academic classrooms full of rows of silent students learning jazz from textbooks and from mathematical formulae. That kind of thing is mostly the result of the feverish imagination of jazz people who've fallen too deeply for their own marketing. And if there are schools like that, well, shame on them. They need to do better. But I've never heard of one in real life, and I've been doing this and thinking about this and researching this for well over 30 years now. So, there is not a real disconnect between the people involved in jazz education and the so-called real world. Which brings me to the next crucial issue, and this is going to be my main point today. Other critiques of jazz education attack it on the grounds that what goes on in education isn't the same as what happens on the bandstand. The important thing to know is that that kind of argument is based on a fairly significant misunderstanding of what jazz education is. People who make that argument are conflating practice and pedagogy. The argument mistakenly assumes that the logics and priorities of teaching and learning must be the same as playing professional gigs, but they're not. They just aren't. They're quite different. In the case of jazz education, teaching is about building knowledge, developing skills, cultivating dispositions, training students in the procedures and the traditions and the possibilities of jazz. To quote education and knowledge-building theorist Carl Mayton, educational knowledge does not simply reflect the practices of knowledge producers within a discipline. One cannot understand school physics by studying the research practices of physicists, and vice versa. Similarly, we can't understand jazz education by studying the performance practices of professional jazz musicians alone. If you want to understand jazz education, you need to look at jazz education itself. We need to understand that education is designed for teaching and learning. It follows the logics and the priorities of pedagogy, and because of that, it can look quite different from what jazz musicians do on stage at gigs or in the studio. So what does that mean? Well, here are some examples. In music lessons, students might practice various drills like scales or arpeggios or sequences or studies or etudes. Any of those things in isolation may not sound anything much like real, authentic jazz improvising because they aren't, and they aren't meant to be. They're for building things like skill and for increasing fluency, and they're for facilitating more efficient technique. So, the great jazz bass player Rufus Reid was mistaken when he criticised jazz education as having a cookie-cutter effect that produced students who all sound alike because they all study from the same pattern book. Reference below. Why was he mistaken? Because his comment evaluates exercises and training drills that are used in educational settings according to the criteria of professional jazz performing. They're the wrong criteria to apply. Also, as a quick aside, even if they were all playing from the same pattern book, do they really all end up sounding alike? Really? Well, to all non-jazz fans, of course, they do. To non-jazz folks, most jazz does all sound exactly the same. But to jazz people, there's a massive diversity of sound. Sure, musicians playing in the same style as each other, they'll have similarities, but that's because they're playing in the same style. That's what style is. That's the whole point of style. We love to talk about the unique sound and approach of this or that great player, but listen closely to any jazz musician for long enough, and you'll be able to instantly recognize their playing too. If you're a teacher, I bet you can recognize the playing of students who you know really well. Everyone in jazz has their own sound and approach. Every jazz musician sounds identical only to themselves. The magic of creativity and the flexibility that improvisation gives us is that even though most students probably do practice a lot of the same scales and patterns, eventually they emerge with diverse and with personal approaches. And that brings me to another quick aside. Please, stop comparing students at school or university who are just learning with jazz greats at the height of their career, carrying on about how kids don't have a unique sound and style like Coltrane or whoever did after years as a professional player. Really? Please. Just please take a moment to think about how absurd that kind of comparison is. And if you heard Coltrane when he was in college and he was in love with the style of Johnny Hodges and tried to play and sound just like Johnny Hodges, those people, well, they'd probably write him off too as just another cookie-cutter clone. Students and new graduates at the start of their career are just learning their craft. They're just learning. You can't evaluate their future playing by what they do before they've become seasoned musicians. Also, in the same way, it makes no sense to evaluate pedagogy according to the priorities and the criteria of performance in a professional setting. Performance and pedagogy are not the same thing. Gigs and music lessons aren't the same thing. That brings me to the next big issue, the third big issue. Because performance and education aren't the same thing, being a good performer doesn't make someone a good teacher. To be good at teaching, you need to be good at teacher kinds of things. And to be good at playing jazz at gigs, you need to be good at performer kinds of things. Playing at gigs and teaching are two very different things. They have different priorities and require totally different skill sets. Should teachers be able to play? Yes, they should. As I've said elsewhere, modelling how to play, that is demonstrating techniques and sounds, is a really important part of teaching. But does a teacher need to be a top-level performer? No. Lots of them are, but many aren't. It doesn't matter, because to be an effective teacher, you need good teaching skills. You need to be a good teacher. The problem is that jazz people and jazz schools are in love with fame. They're in love with marketing. Universities put marquee players on their faculty to attract students. Students get excited by the idea of studying with a famous player. Of course, sometimes that works out really well for them. Lots of great players are also great teachers. Many are able to think through the steps involved in doing what they do and break these down to understandable and actionable steps for students, presenting them in a logical sequence. But on the other hand, there are plenty of excellent players who really can't or don't wish to explain how they play the way they do. It's probably fair to say that in the later stages of learning jazz, high-level students, well, they're in a good position to learn from the mentorship and modelling of master players. By the time a student's advanced and at professional entry level, it's good for people who already know what to do, who already know the rules of the game. But what about less advanced students? What about students who don't have much background in jazz yet? Students who don't already know what to do. Those students, they can be seriously disadvantaged by the valorization of performing over teaching. If you don't already know what to look for, implicit teaching, it's not much use. I contend that the unfortunate side effect of assuming that pedagogy and performance are the same thing is a lot of bad teaching that alienates or fails far too many students. It's unfair and lazy to argue that talent will out, because really it probably won't. Not in most people. Good teaching, effective learning, dedication, hard work, encouragement, useful, constructive feedback, opportunity, and time. They're all needed for someone to learn how to play jazz well. Leaving students to teach themselves just favours certain people. It favours the ones with the background or the support to know what they need to be doing. For the others left behind by implicit teaching or non-teaching, it's just bad luck. But imagine what some of them might achieve in jazz if they're just given the chance and the help they need. Imagine the greatness that our world might be missing because most students are written off as not naturally talented. How much more respect might jazz be given if more people had positive experiences with it through good education? Pedagogy does not equal performance. Just being a good player doesn't make anyone a good teacher. If we're looking seriously for people who are good teachers, we need to find people who are good at teaching and are dedicated to teaching and take the process of education seriously, and people who understand the difference between what education is and what performance at gigs is. Just because someone can play doesn't mean they can teach.